Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good golly, Miss Molly. Welcome to That 70s Rock Fan with me, your host, Brian. And today we're going to do one of those contradictory things that I do in this channel. Even though my name is That 70s Rock Fan, I talk a lot about science fiction because I'm a contrarian. So I like to confound expectations. And I'm very pleased to welcome a special guest today, scholar, former and current broadcaster in various formats, and author, most critically for today, author of some wonderful science fiction tales. I'd like to welcome my friend Raquel, RM Briggs. How are you today?
Well, I'm doing great. I'm very excited to be here. I just want to start off by saying thank you for inviting me. And maybe at the end of all of this, you can ask me about why I love Steely Dan so much, and
I
then maybe
will.
fit in with with
I
the
will
podcast.
definitely do that. And of course,
Okay.
immediately you hear the name, you go, William Burroughs. But yes, I will certainly talk. We could talk about music. We can talk about anything you want. Absolutely no problem there. I should say also fellow resident of the frozen north. And as I was saying before we started, the lights are flashing here because it's blowing a blizzard outside. So if I disappear, then just carry on without me. The lights keep flashing. The power's hanging in there though. So I hope you're okay though. Hope everything's
Well,
okay.
the weather here was dodgy yesterday. Yesterday we had our quasi blizzard, and
Yeah.
that filled the streets and made everything slippery and crazy. But hang in there.
Will do. And yeah, so we will now. We're going to talk about a number of things, but I do want to talk specifically about your stories, and I will provide links in the description for everybody that's watching how to find those and how to find Raquel. Um, Specifically, we're going to be talking about, after we've covered various other things, these science fiction tales, volumes 1 and 2. And if you hear a rustling of paper out there, it's because I have thousands of notes. Now, my process is I write notes, and then I write notes about the notes, and then I completely forget to look at them as we're talking because I have no producer. So I look at them after and go, why didn't I mention that?
We need
So
to get you a producer.
I do. I desperately need a producer because usually and I'm actually about to expand my studio. This isn't about me, this show today. It's going to be about you, but I'm actually about to try and expand my studio a bit with more screens, because I literally lose track of all the open windows because they're all in tabs. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So, and we were talking about this T-shirt. So
We were.
you can tell our wonderful audience today what this T-shirt represents.
Well, that's the Trexcetera Museum, and it used to be in Drumheller. And unfortunately, we lost that museum. It was a couple of guys, two very nice guys, who had purchased hundreds of thousands of dollars, or I think in excess of $500,000 worth of the auctioned materials
Mm,
from various iterations of Star Trek. And they opened up a beautiful museum, and
yeah,
unfortunately, they just couldn't make it. There wasn't enough foot traffic,
I
and the gate
know.
could not hold the the amount of money needed
Yeah,
for them to sustain the museum. So unfortunately, it shut down.
it's
But the
very
good
sad.
news is that we got to go.
We got to go.
Yeah,
Yes, we've
and
both been there.
you went with Command, and of course, I went with Red. So I have the red version of it.
Okay. I would have bought more if I'd realized at the time. I would have
Yeah,
bought
that's
more
true. I
things.
actually stopped putting my coffee cup into the dishwasher once I realized that they
There
were
wasn't
gone. I
no
was like,
more.
"Oh,
I know
no."
it's so sad, and it's a it was a wonderful place. That's why I wanted to mention because we've both been there, and I'm so proud that I did manage to get there, and also obviously the town of Vulcan. I've been there too, which has got a big Star Trek thing going on. I wonder why. Um,
Yeah,
so,
but you raise a good point, because I think if more Americans especially would have known what, I guess for lack of a better term, what a hotbed
yeah,
Alberta was for traditional Star Trek, classic Star Trek. I
That's
think
right.
perhaps those venues would have been able to, sustain themselves. You know, Vulcan is not what it used to be either, and I mean, that was an entire town blessed by Leonard Nimoy himself.
I know, it's incredible. A lot of people really don't know that, and it's quite sad. But it is there. Vulcan is there. There's still a Star Trek experience there, and they have
Mhm.
various events. So, hey, well, that could be another video entirely. But it is interesting because obviously Star Trek is a huge thing for both of us. And I did want to start by talking about how you got into science fiction and that journey, that gateway of it. We all had our own experience of whether it was picking up a certain book or watching a certain show. Just what, how did you become such a passionate science fiction um, aficionado, for
Well,
want of a better word?
well, I had a very unusual childhood. So I grew up in a band, but not in the glamorous sense. A lot of people, I think, in the public have this idea that if you grow up in a band, that it's incredibly glamorous, it's really wonderful, and it wasn't. It was sort of more like how Mozart grew up.
Hmm.
In so far as it is a very humble existence.
Hmm.
So I had quite an impecunious childhood, and we traveled a lot, and we lived in hotels and motels. And of course, we traveled to hotels and motels, doing various circuits and various gigs.
Yeah.
And so this happened throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, and then of course my family sort of slowed down a little bit and stayed in the vicinity in Alberta. And so the long and short of it is this: late night hotel rooms. The What's on television is science fiction, and one of my mother's guitar players actually loved Star Trek, and so it was on the TV, and I watched it, and that was it. I was in. I was a Star Trek. I was pulled in, and I was an instant fan in the true sense of that word. I was a fanatic from the get go. I thought it was just a beautiful and peculiar world, and also, you know, I was very small, so I was also scared, but it was the kind of fear that
Hmm.
that wasn't off putting. There was no gore. Um, there was nothing, you know, violent. It was a different type of fear. It was
Yeah.
a cerebral and emotional fear, and so that was the birth of my obsession
I
with
have to,
science fiction.
no, and I have to say it's fairly similar for me. I think it was watching the gateway for me wasn't so much the novel books and novels and stories, which I did get into very swiftly at a young age, but it was watching things like the OG Star Trek, Doctor
Hmm.
Who, and so on that sparked that love of this genre where you could see these other worlds and other experiences and all sorts of great things visually happening. But also then I guess what started to appeal to me, and hopefully it's the same for you, is that was the writing behind that.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
you know, so okay, well, maybe I can read some of those things too, you know,
yeah.
those stories. So I mean, in terms of inspiration, from an authorship perspective, what are some of your inspirations there?
Well, for me, uh, I had an intense love for Star Trek
Mm,
because we moved from one side of Canada to the other, and we did that because the whole family was involved professionally
yeah.
in music, and that's very important for me to mention because I think that there has been a little bit of wishful thinking and perhaps quite a lot of exaggeration as to what was available in Alberta in the
Mm.
1970s, and there wasn't much on offer. So the ability to watch Star Trek, I didn't have quite the ability to watch the same things that our American counterparts did. And you
Yeah.
always hear these marvelous stories about our friends down south and how they had this enriched experience with science fiction throughout their entire lives, due
Mm.
to the fact that, of course, the United States is a culture machine.
Just
And
many, many more channels physically. I mean, it's the
yeah,
same in the
and
UK. We had like 2 channels, then 3, then 4. We didn't
well,
have the breadth of broadcasting to be able
that's
to see
just
that
it,
stuff.
isn't it?
Yeah.
When I was growing up, we had 3 channels, and of course, because we're in Canada, one of the channels had to be French. I mean, I at that time, we didn't even have FM radio. So I
Mm.
think that there has been a little bit on the Canadian side, a bit of wishful thinking and perhaps, exaggerating, like I said, about, what
It's the
tender
access
years.
to those things, yeah.
Yes, yes, access and of course, the exposure at tender years. So that's why that's how I got into the science fiction aspect. And certainly,
Yeah.
there were books around due to the musicians that were around me, written by Carl Sagan and others. And so I fell in love with science fiction, and
Mm.
from quite a young age, I was identified by my teachers as somebody who ought to write some things. And of
Okay.
course,
Yeah.
I had a very modest childhood, as I said earlier. So I actually rejected that whole idea. I thought, you know what? I'm going to go be a lawyer. I need some money. Let's,
But
you know,
there's no guarantee of any cash in writing science fiction, that's for sure.
no, and that's exactly it. And leave it to me to choose the smallest, least profitable genre in which to write.
That's right.
Um, so I fell in love with it, and I didn't write. Of course, I ran restaurants with my ex, and then after being involved with the restaurants, I did some time in radio, and then I went back to university, and then COVID hit, and
Mm.
we were in these groups where we were only allowed to visit with certain people. And I was invited to a dinner party. My daughter was hosting a dinner party, and she is connected to the arts community. She's quite a talented model and actress. And so at this dinner party, I noticed that nobody had anything to do. And so when the next dinner party came around, I wrote a short story, and I thought, this
Ah.
will I'll get her to read this to everyone, and it'll be something that we can talk about. I'll make it incredibly provocative, and so we'll get tongues wagging. And much to my surprise, it was a huge hit. So I was asked, where are all these? Do you have more of these stories? And of course I said, no, I just usually toss them. And I was scolded. I was told to never do that ever again, and to start keeping the
Keeping them
stories
and
and
building on
submitting.
them, yeah.
And
That
so that's how I fell into to writing it. I mean, I did go to university for 4 years, and I did study writing,
yeah.
but I studied the professional side of writing. It wasn't until after that I had taken some Harvard X courses and started, cultivating this idea of doing fiction.
Can
Yeah.
I ask if that story first story you read at the dinner party, is that one of the ones that's published today, or does that one still to be published?
No, that one was published today. It was published in the first volume.
It is in the first volume. I just wondered if that was one of the stories that then you'd ended up publishing, or whether it was still in the back burner because it was the first one that you'd read.
It's Jack.
It's Jack. It is
Yes,
Jack. Okay.
it's
No,
Jack.
that's cool. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah. No, I'm
and
glad to hear that. I am very glad. So that was the second story in the book, in the first volume,
yeah.
which is actually, and I'm jumping ahead because I do want to talk more about the story specifically. I've got a few more background things I want to go over, but that one is an interesting one because it's a slightly different view of the world that's created in some of the other stories.
Mhm.
It could still be a part of that world, and it is, I think, but it's from a very, very different perspective. So
Yes.
it's a very interesting story. So that one's Jack. So short stories.
Mhm.
Well, you mentioned money. I mean, there's one of the most famous short stories of all time, Isaac Asimov's Nightfall,
Mhm.
where he got paid 1.75 cents per word.
Yeah.
But that was double the normal rate because Jack Campbell really wanted that story.
Yeah.
So why short stories? Is there a particular love of that genre? Because they're very important in science fiction. Short stories are the ones I started reading as a kid, compilations of short stories. Why short stories?
Well, there are 3 reasons. The beginning of my love for short stories is I was a voracious reader as a child, a voracious reader to an extreme. So I was, if you spoke to any of my teachers when I was young, I was one of those strange kids who participated in those reading log programs where you would
Mm,
go around in your neighborhood and you would ask for a penny or a quarter or a nickel a page, and you would try and read as many books as you could, and the money would be donated to charity. So voracious reader. And on that journey, I fell in love with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and I fell in love with Edgar Allan Poe. And so
oh,
a lot of short story reading when I was young. And then the thing is this: when I went back to university, um, and and I began to study communications and technology, I had always loved technology, and so I start studying it, and as a scholar, I was seeing the ways that various types of technology could be used and abused against individuals and against society. So I really cared about talking about those ideas, but I wanted to talk about those ideas within the confines of something that resembled the Socratic dialectic. And in that, I mean that I did not want to have a stranglehold on the reader. I did not want to tell the reader what I thought. I wanted to present the ways in which you could interact with these various types of technology and medical advancements and all of these things, and leave it up to you to decide
yeah.
what you think. And so
Well, yeah, and that's one of the aspects of these stories that I particularly enjoy is that the story unfolds in respect of the interaction with technology and some of these, like say Happily Ever After, where it's you're not imposing an outcome from an emotional perspective of how it would go. You're logically laying out the end result of that interaction. That's how I feel when I read them. So this
well, I'm happy
technology is
that you
being,
feel that way
yeah.
because, as a com and a tech scholar, I do have to, and as a science fiction fan, I do have to emphasize the fact that this is hard science fiction,
Mm,
and that I try to be as meticulous as possible, but also try to make it comprehensible, so that folks can understand how this technology works, and how it will affect them without alienating them. I don't want it to be so technical that it's unreadable, and so sometimes you have to, write it in a way in which people can understand it, and the ramifications of it, but also stay technical enough so that when somebody's finished reading what I've written, I want them to feel edified. I want them to feel like, wow, I did not know about that medical advance, that piece of technology, this type of system. I did not realize that it worked this way. I understand it better now.
well,
And so that's a part of what I try to do.
that's an important aspect of these stories and the world that you've built, and many of them are interconnected. They're not. Each story can be read separately, no problem. But there are interconnections. You built a world. Is that the technology described in the world or worlds that you've built?
Mhm.
For instance, like Happily Ever After, or uh, some of the other Digitals Forever. Let's say whatever. The um, it's not technology that is alien to us as in today's world that we live in. it's just extrapolated a little further. But for me, it evokes, well, this is the logical outcome of somebody interfacing with that technology. Let's say it's a virtual reality that they live in for medical reasons, or it's a sexually an approved sexual outlet, shall we say, without giving too many spoilers away. What would happen, even in today's technology, we just went a little further, and what would be the unexpected outcomes of that?
Yeah.
Good or bad?
Yes.
Often bad. And I like that, because it's not saying, well, this would be all sweetness and light or roses or whatever, and it would be for the best and society would be wonderful. It's pointing out the realities, the unexpected realities. I don't know if I'm interpreting those correctly, of course, but that's how it feels to me.
Well, you have interpreted them correctly, because that is the journey that I want to take the reader on. It's important, I think, for people to not only understand this technology in an applied sense, but also, make a judgment about it for themselves and walk away with their own opinions, and perhaps, act on them. And that could be, to act on them in their individual lives, or to act on them insofar as, how much they're going to use AI. And if they do, they have an informed sense. And that circles back on this thing that you asked me to begin with, why short stories? And I think it's really important to mention that, short stories are conducive to science fiction, not only because science fiction typically likes to go celluloid. That's the relationship. So science fiction stories like to be made into film. They like to be made into TV. But also, folks need to realize that science fiction, and we have a lot of genre conflation these days, but science fiction should explore ideas. And that's what it's there for. It's there to help you grapple with, come to grips with the challenges we're going to face in the future now, and the future. And before, we were sort of anxious about when we reached out into the universe and what was going to reach back. Even Stephen Hawking was a little frightened. He said, here we're reaching out, but what's going to reach back? And he was frightened. So it's important that folks realize that science fiction provides us with that mechanism. It's not there for us to figure out what makes us tingle in our naughty bits. It's not there to,
although there are stories that deal with the consequences of that.
Yes.
Like, my favorite, I think, is Happily Ever After, which
lovely.
is very much based around the consequences of that, but also identity. That one's very much about identity, but also tingling in the naughty bits.
Yes.
Well, as the pleasure area, the pleasure district, the whole bit.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the pleasure district is an important part of the storytelling within these certain places. There's a local scholar who I deeply admire and deeply respect, my friend David, literary scholar. The guy, I believe, is a preeminent intellectual in Canada. I just absolutely adore him. And he called my work something that I was previously unfamiliar with until he told me about it, and then I had to go and read about it. It's this idea of heterocosmica, so these possible worlds. And so I like to now use this term because it really is what I have created. Star Trek is heterocosmica, whereas my work is also heterocosmic.
Exploring possible outcomes. And actually, as I was trying to probably inexpertly say, not imposing a certain outcome, exploring the outcome.
Yes, and Star Trek was never a foregone conclusion. It wasn't like Gene Roddenberry was saying, no, this is the definite future. And so now anybody who watches it it should say, oh, he got that so wrong. That's not the storytelling apparatus. He's not trying to predict the future as future, as nonfiction.
Yeah, it's an
His
exploration.
act is an act of heterocosmica. It
All
is an
possible worlds.
act
Yeah,
of a possible world that could exist, a possible future, a possible world. And
yeah.
so that's where my stories exist, and I like to keep them in that little universe. Is it
It,
another reality, or is it a
well,
possible
that's
future?
one of my constant questions when I'm reading those stories is this just an extrapolation of a slightly further forward today? Is this a different reality? And I love that. And I don't want it answered. I never want that answered.
It
Although
well,
there are
I won't
references
tell
in
you
there,
whether or
though.
not I'm ever gonna answer it, but I will tell you that keeping you suspended in that where you're like, you're not sure, that is something that I take great pleasure in
Yeah,
creating.
it's recognizable enough to say, yes, this could happen in our world. These extrapolations of technology, particularly in their impact.
Yeah.
And there are references. There's certainly a Dune reference, and there's an Elon Musk joke in there. So so there are references to what could be seen as today's world that we live in, whether that's real or not. Of course, I'm a big
Yeah.
believer in simulation theory. I mean, but that's a whole other discussion.
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
um, I like that ambiguity, but that's the ambiguity that allows you to explore, I think, these ideas. And the outcomes, as I say, in some of some people look at these and say that's a very nihilistic outcome. It's a possible outcome, not necessarily good or bad. It's just the inevitable result of that interaction with, let's say, technology, or in many cases, I find that because you've created this great world of digital technology, controlling physical technology. It's a little bit dystopian, a little bit authoritarian. Many of the outcomes I find are, and I don't want to give spoilers away. I certainly don't want to give too many spoilers. That is that clash with almost who's running the show. So somebody gets into an unfortunate interaction with an AI operated drone. Well, who's really running the show? Because that drone's it's programmed to act in a certain way, and it's going to do that regardless of circumstances on the ground. I
Yeah.
think that's a very astute observation about technology. It isn't necessarily going to be maliciously operated by some guy pulling a lot of levers. It's just bureaucratic bloat will cause it to work that way.
That is one of the things that is concerning. It is
Mm,
one of the aspects of it that is concerning, and also autonomy, because we all know
mm,
that it's not really autonomous, is it? It
yeah.
knows what it's fed. So
Mm.
you have to realize that what it's fed is what it becomes. And so, what are we feeding it?
Yes, and that
So
seems to be the result of a lot of the outcomes in some of the stories are that you can't argue with with something that's been fed a certain programming.
yeah,
If there's a villain, I guess in some of these it would be Elinctus. I can never say that properly.
yeah.
Elinctus could be seen as the villain, the big bad. I don't know. Just speculating. And even then, there's not necessarily a all controlling, all powerful. We are trying to control you all. It's just that the way that the systems have developed that
Yes.
may be causing.
Well, I think the whole idea of the all controlling thing has been done before.
Yeah,
And I don't think that it is quite.
there's no Bond villain here.
No. And I like the idea of it coming from all directions, because it's far more insidious for me as a reader and as a writer to know that it is coming from every direction and
Mm,
not just one villain that we slay at the end of the novel. And
yes.
so it's just every little choice we make, and the fact that we are creating this ecosystem, and connecting to the idea that it's an ecosystem and that there are lots of creatures in that ecosystem, and how they take effect on human beings and
Yeah.
on various systems of government, systems of education, systems of relationships, that affect the individual and the society writ large.
Yeah, and a lot of the stories do discuss that and portray people caught up in those situations. It isn't all technologically related. There are some
No.
stories that are, let's say, okay, so there's some stories that involve alien entities,
Yes.
and I don't think you've portrayed humans as being the spacefaring race
Hmm.
so much in these stories yet. It's more things coming to us, and some of the unexpected things we learn about those entities, um, which they may not be homogenous either, of course. So that's so there are different flavors in these stories for sure, I would say.
I love that you picked up on that, because I think that
Yeah.
in the first book, some folks read it and they were like, "Oh, okay, so this is a little bit about horror.
Mhm.
Is she going to go in
There's some
the way of
Poe-like
fantasy?"
stuff. Yeah.
But I've not gone the way of fantasy at all.
No,
Um,
no.
you are correct that that they come to us. But after reading Stephen Hawking's last book,
Mm,
um, I just really felt that that was the story that needed to be told. The things that worry people like Stephen Hawking worry me. And so, like I
indeed.
said, I
We
read
shouldn't
his
be
last
going,
book, and
hello, hello.
you
Wait,
know,
wait.
yeah, yeah, it's just his words they really touched me,
Mm,
and I really enjoyed his last book, and I just thought, this is something I want to have a conversation about, but I
yeah,
want the conversation to not be, this pulp science fiction. I want it to be a cerebral and edifying trip. I want somebody to be able to get into the book, read a story, encounter some type of innovation, invention, technological
yeah.
advancement, or some type of meeting. uh,
Yeah.
and what would happen on the other side of it, and tell it in a realistic way, because I do want to honor science fiction in that way. We don't have science fiction anymore. Science
Yeah.
fiction is dying. And you can see it in multiple articles written by publishers and editors
Mm,
about how the genre is perpetually shrinking, and it's because the mechanism is broken.
yeah.
Not
How
many people.
difficult is it to navigate that mechanism for publishing
I
and
mean, we don't have magazines anymore, and that
yeah.
was typically how this was happening. And I think the public at large, they have their own areas of expertise in life, not publishing, and they don't realize that how dependent new authors were, and how just utterly dependent science fiction was on magazines. And
Yeah.
magazines had this evergreen quality where they would be left in a diner, they would be in the doctor's office,
Hmm.
they could be left on the bus, and people were reading these stories, and it wasn't
Yeah.
difficult to get into those magazines and into those newspapers, and to have your story go the traditional viral.
Yeah, and that's one of the first things that I remember about reading science fiction, apart from getting books from the library or whatever, was I think magazines like Analog and so
Mhm.
on. It was
Omni.
yeah, very easy to access, as you say. They were lying around everywhere, or an older brother or sister might have it, or whatever,
Yeah.
or even in the library they had them. So it was easy to pick them up. And of course, it's short stories, so it's not
Mhm.
like you were as a 8-year-old, 9-year-old, 10-year-old, you were concentrating on this novel this thick.
Yeah.
It was accessible, it was digestible, one idea per story. Um, Now that I don't know if there's such a thing now, is there? I mean, is there?
Well, I've tried to explain this to other folks, and it's important for me to say it again, and that is this idea that science fiction is about ideas, and so when it takes place in a short story, you just focus on the idea, and it's such a pure and beautiful and gratifying experience. And if you want to expand it, unfortunately, once you start expanding an idea, usually how they fatten it up is by introducing lots of character, and romance and relationships and
Padding, as
interpersonal.
I call it.
Pardon?
I call it padding.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's just you're adding all this interpersonal stuff, and what it winds up doing is it helps extend the story, and it fattens it up, right?
Yeah.
Or it pads it out, right?
Well, we
And
see it in television all the time. It's
yeah,
very thin ideas being padded to the extreme with extraneous stuff that's not necessary just
yeah.
to make up a certain running time.
Yeah, exactly, and that's unfortunate, and I think that that has been science fiction's undoing. Is, in Hollywood, in corporate Hollywood, and in corporate publishing, they're looking for these character-driven, and that's code for a bunch of things, but
People
they're looking
talking
for
in hallways about their feelings. Yeah.
exactly, and and the ideas are no longer there. And because the
Mm.
ideas are no longer there, people aren't inspired by science fiction anymore, and that's unfortunate.
Well, I think the ideas they shy away from the ideas very often in modern science fiction. They actually don't really want to tackle the ideas. Unlike in the way you've done in your stories, they want to avoid that for some reason. Like they don't want to
Well,
take a core idea. They want fantastical stuff,
mhm,
like just stupid, fantastical, totally fantasy
yeah,
ideas about how something might work or how, well, here's a MacGuffin, how we could do this.
yeah,
But they don't want to talk about real ideas about which OG Star Trek, for instance, as we know, used to deal with, the impact of technology.
yes. Well, the
Um,
thing is then you have to call in experts.
mhm,
Gene Roddenberry had Isaac Asimov on speed dial, and so that's
mhm,
that's a part of it, right? And I think that just Hollywood would just rather dramatize things. I mean, it
yeah,
was the undoing of Star Trek. And when Star Trek started out, Gene famously said everywhere he went that they rejected the original Star Trek because they thought it was too cerebral. And wow, were they ever wrong. The
yeah.
minute it went into syndication and normies saw it, they fell in love, and it was just a magical thing for them.
Yeah.
But I just think that right now corporations are focused on content; they're not focused on quality. And I do see that effect of, somebody who wants to be a famous romance author or wants to write for this cartoon or this television show or that television show. They don't have any expertise. They don't have
No.
expertise in futurism, in innovation, in invention, in technology, in communications, in
Well, they're right.
astrophysics.
I think they're writing fanfic of the worst kind. Often
Mhm.
it's whereas as you say and we'll go back to Star Trek as an example, the cerebral, technologically driven, idea driven format then allowed you to incorporate the personalities of the recurring characters, or
Exactly.
even rather than, well, let's start with identity and personality, and we'll try and build some fantastic dark fantasy around it that just
Yeah.
does silly things.
It's
Very,
preposterous.
yeah, it's a backwards approach.
It is.
Yeah, but short stories, to go back to that, the fact that you can have an idea and then just discuss that idea. What are some of the challenges though in that format for world building, given that you may only have literally 3 pages, or that's as far as you want to go?
Well, that's the thing is, that it is a discipline unto itself. And
Hmm.
so, lots of people have said to me, "Oh, when are you gonna do a novel?" Well, I've been cooking a novel for a while, but it just doesn't feel the same to me as short stories, because
Yeah.
short stories are, you're immersed. It's like you jump off a cliff, or you it's like going through the Stargate. You're you're there at the doorway, you step through, you're in somewhere that is totally different. You have this experience, and then you come back on the other side of it. So um, I think some of the challenges are to I think some of the challenges are for a regular author, I think would be the compound complex sentences, the density of writing.
Yeah.
because you have to fit a lot into very little. And
Yes, and that is
to
a skill.
yeah, and to stay on track and just stick with the idea.
'Cause, yeah, what do you leave out more than what do you put in?
You do. And so you have to that's why it takes a long time,
Yeah.
Edgar Allan Poe, I believe it was Edgar Allan Poe who once made an argument that a short story should be written in one sitting. Well, that certainly can't happen for me because I'm not writing gothic horror. I'm trying to write something that would help somebody escape into a new world, to
Mm.
have a great time, to be totally freaked out, to learn about some type of technology or some type of invention or innovation or some possibility, and then come out on the other side of it saying, wow, okay, I know this, I know this, I know this, and I know this. And I want it to stick to the reader. I want it to stick for a long time. I want
Yeah,
them to be thinking about it for a long time.
indeed. And, the ethical dilemmas that are involved, which you address a lot, in these stories, I think that's a key component too, for me.
Well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, I do have a refereed SOI. That's a statement of intent for a doctorate in social science. But I mean, it's like $84,000 for the to
Holy.
finish that out, and I just don't have $84,000. But it
You
definitely
don't?
no.
Who doesn't
Um,
have that lying around?
no, and I'm not willing to put my family through that at my age.
Yeah,
I'm well
yeah,
over 50. I'm in my mid 50s, and it's not working for me.
yeah,
But to the reason why I bring that up is because that matters a lot to me. It matters a lot to me how these things will have an impact on individuals and society. I want people to feel empowered by the things they read in my stories. Frightened, yes.
yeah,
Concerned, yes. But feeling empowered by what they now know, and they know how it moves, how it shakes,
yeah.
how it manifests itself.
Well, that's a large part of what attracts me to these stories is that ethical discussion, or indeed just laying out the potential ethical outcomes of something. If you look at recurring, and as I say, a lot of these stories are interlinked. They're not all necessarily linear, but they are. Most of them are in the world that you've created. Vincent's Libertine Gallery
Mhm.
features in a number of stories, both with characters within it and in this pleasure district area where future society has led to the technologicalization of tingly bits and what you do with them.
Yes.
Uh, and what are some of the impacts of that on
Yeah.
both the people involved in that profession or professions and the people that are using that profession? And the fact that the global establishment decides, well, this certain things are okay in here. Certain things can happen here that before would have been seen as heinous, but now because it's technology, well, we're going to say that's okay in there. Now
Yeah.
that's a great discussion because you can actually see things heading that way
Well,
in
thank you.
real time.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. But yeah, that is a part of what I try to do. I think too much focus sometimes is put on when we're talking about that particular subject without giving away too many spoilers. I
Mm,
think society focuses too much sometimes, not all the time. I'm not an absolutist type of person. I'm very moderate. They focus too much on content, and not on the people surrounding that content. What goes into making that content? And if we were to compare it to something, let's look at Pornhub. Let's look at
mm,
OnlyFans. Let's look at these
indeed.
possibilities, and
All of
let's
which
look at
are
the
referenced in alternative versions in your stories, you see.
yes, and it's very important for us to look at these things and not to just to look at the technology and how that technology takes shape, but and what the end result is, but the people surrounding it and the people producing it, and how they produce it, and what the cost is to them.
And even the very definition of what is a person and what
Yes.
rights do, I don't know if the word is right word would be individuals, regardless of what kind of individual they are.
Yeah.
What rights do they have in this semi-dystopian, authoritarian, brave new world?
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes we talk, you know, in grand on a grand scale about what it means to be dehumanized, but at the same time, I want folks to engage with the idea that perhaps they're in control
Mm,
of dehumanizing themselves, and connecting to the power that they have over the message, and the message is strong, and but you know, we all have a core identity, and we have the capacity within ourselves to say no, and to stand up, and to live by what we know to be the
mm,
right thing for ourselves, and as a society. You know,
yeah.
in North America, we're very focused on this idea of individualism. And I think that that's absolutely marvelous. But it's also important to remember that there's a completely separate topic within individualism. And that is, as a society, we choose to live together collectively in
I,
little units when
collective
we agree.
individualism.
Yeah, when we agree on certain things.
Yeah.
So social cohesion
Mm,
is created when we agree on things. You know, I mean, was excuse me. I think it was Dr. Noah Harari who was
mm,
talking about how Neanderthals, they previously they felt that they had no humanity, and then he talks at length in one of his
yeah.
books. He's
Wasn't
an
that cut and
Oxford
dried?
professor, about how they discovered that Neanderthals were actually caring for their elderly. So
You're talking about my ancestors, you know.
yes, I know my husband's as well. So it wasn't just Homo sapiens who were doing that, but it was Neanderthals. It was
Yeah.
Neanderthals that were doing that, and so they were living in these collective groups. And now we now know, when we see these their elderly and their children who were born with defects, and so on and so forth, that they were carried by their family. They were
Mm,
protected by their families. They lived in these collective groups,
yeah.
and the Dr. Harari talks about this because he wants us to understand the social circumstances that create society, and that create civility, and how each society has its own idea of civility. And so, you know, we don't have to speak in grand terms about individualism, because individualism is awesome. It's incredible. And absolutely, we need it. I'm not arguing for a collectivist society. This has nothing to do with that. What
No,
I'm
but
saying is,
discussions on that are in the stories.
yes,
Yeah.
what I am saying is that we also have to make sure that we don't we don't pretend that social cohesion isn't necessary, because social
Mm,
cohesion is necessary. It is very important for all the individuals to have some shared values
mm,
in order to be able to keep that society together. And so I do try to make that argument as a scholar, that that it is important that we have certain things that we agree on, that we're
yes.
willing to protect.
But what some of your stories brilliantly do is explore the inevitable outcome, or the possible outcome, sorry, of what if social cohesion says a certain thing is or isn't acceptable.
Yes.
It may be a good thing, or seen as a good thing for society as a whole, but
Yeah.
what are some of the actual impacts of that in practice, particularly with technology being driven by some faceless bureaucratic AI type scenario? So um, I like that. I love those explorations. Okay, this
Well,
could happen.
I'm glad that you're enjoying them.
Yeah.
I would like to direct you to the rough draft. As you know, I'm following Andy Weir. You know, Andy
Mm,
Weir couldn't get published traditionally, so he went to Patreon.
yeah.
So I did as I was told by my readers. They said, "You waited too long. Get your butt over to Patreon." So I'm over there at Patreon. And as you know, I pre-publish all of my rough stories to Amazon. And so right now, worldwide, there is a story that is available called CTOL. And
Yes,
I would love
CTOL.
it
Oops, sorry. Here we go.
if you would go and read CTOL, because if that's the kind of thing that you enjoy, I would love for you to read CTOL. There's also another story along those same lines called Productive. And these are for my upcoming third volume. So this will be Science Fiction Tales Volume 3.
Which I'm eagerly awaiting.
Well, you met my editor,
I did.
and he's a sweetheart, and I love him very much. Like I said, I
There's your
just
Patreon.
respect him immensely. A wonderful literary scholar, and I'm I'm just so grateful for him. I love him so much.
Yeah,
As soon as I get 10 stories out, he'll take a look and tell me what he has to say. And we could have some conversations about adverbs and syntax, and then I'll get it into everyone's hands.
well, I'll be putting all those links to the Patreon, and I mean, I buy stuff on Amazon like many of millions of other unimaginative people, but the where else can we find your works? There's Patreon and Amazon, I guess.
They're also available through Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble. Okay.
And recently, I am very proud to say that Indigo Chapters began carrying my books locally and fully nationwide on their website. And so I'm
Okay.
pretty excited about that because, of course, I don't have an agent, and I'm
Mm.
doing this all independently.
And it is a
Unfortunately,
challenge. Yeah.
it is. Unfortunately, right now, corporate publishers are not interested in science fiction. It's very difficult to get science fiction published these days.
Yeah, and I've noticed that the science fiction establishment that still exists has pretty much got a grip on what gets published as well. I mean, there's a lot of groups that are
Mhm.
gatekeeping the ability to even get seen in compilations and so on. So it's a challenge for sure.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that you're keeping at it,
Well,
and
I
there's
I
more
I
to
love the
come.
way that you put it, and that is exactly what I'm facing because, I just think it's really important for me to say I'm not an activist. I'm a scholar. I
Yeah,
don't write about activism, and I'm not an activist. I'm a scholar looking for a means in which to communicate ideas with people and have a conversation in multiple stories. I want to entertain people. I want people to escape. I want people to be horrified. I want people to feel enlightened. I want people to feel like they learned something, that
yeah.
that I took them on an amazing journey. And I'm not focused on characters and personal lives and interpersonal dynamics and things that make your naughty bits tingle.
Only to
I
the extent that they exist within those worlds and the
Exactly,
ideas, which is the
exactly.
important differential. It's not that they don't exist in there; it's that they serve the story rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and that's not popular right now.
Mm.
The if you go to the various corporate publishers, they do openly talk about the fact that they're not interested in science fiction short story, and the magazines that are still publishing science fiction short story, they're looking for very very specific content and very very specific authors that have very very specific
Yes,
private lives,
indeed.
and and they're pretty open about it. And
They're gatekeeping to the furthest extent that they can do it right now.
yeah, and
Yeah.
it's sad to me because primarily, like, I understand in other genres, but just in science fiction, I can tell you as a writing scholar, and as a communications and technology scholar. Really the heart of true science fiction, the gut, the nucleus, the very center of science fiction is ideas.
Yep.
It's not
And the free exchange of those ideas and discussion of them.
Exactly. And so it can be very frustrating. It's so funny, you know, Stephen Hawking, actually, in his last book, I believe it was his last book, I have a couple of his volumes, but he says, you know, I don't know what I would do if I tried to publish today. I don't think a single person would read my book. There are, and I don't think I could get a single publisher to publish my book. There are so many titles out there, and it's so difficult to publish now. I don't think that anybody would have even have read me.
I think a lot of famous authors could possibly say the same.
Yeah.
If you know what I mean. So, I mean, who knows if an Asimov or a Heinlein or a Silverberg would be published today?
Yeah.
Or indeed any of those other classic writers that I love so much. So it's an interesting landscape we live in. But I'm glad you're plugging away. You're still plugging away.
Well, let's hope that I'm not like Edgar Allan Poe. Let's hope I'm not like H.P. Lovecraft. I don't want to be Kafka. I don't want to be the person who dies unknown. And there have been plenty of authors who have died unknown.
Van Gogh never sold a painting in his lifetime. So that
exactly. So, you know, I have sold about 1,000 copies. And I can tell you that with Amazon's print on demand scheme, that there's absolutely no money in it.
Yeah.
I really do mean no money in it. But 1,000 copies have been sold.
That's why volume 3, I'll be trying to buy it from your own hands.
Well,
when it's
you
launched.
have no idea. You have no idea how much I appreciate that, to see you at my book launch, for you to travel all that distance to come to the book launch.
Next time I'll spend longer.
Everyone was so delighted to see you, and everybody, they thought it was just terrific, and I'm glad you got to meet all of my friends and
great Gragnar,
and it was just terrific, and you know, I just thank you for supporting me and for, you know,
my pleasure. And you really enjoy these stories, Science Fiction Tales, RM Briggs. Everybody will put the links in the description. You can buy individual stories, or you can buy the complete collections, or you could do both. And there's the Patreon. One more question before we wrap up, because I am interested. What emerging technology or concept, scientific concept, might feature going forward in a new story? What's new or developing that you're interested in?
I am interested in things that are happening in healthcare. And so it's not just it's not just the physical equipment that is is growing by leaps and bounds. It's not growing, it's advancing by leaps and bounds. So I get into that in the new book, but there are also comm systems that are happening in healthcare that I want to explore. So I'm looking at that, and I'm also looking at the various types of incursions on sovereignty and how that can affect the individual and the society. So I don't want to give too much away.
No.
I'm cooking 2 stories right now. So I'm about 1,300 words. No, I think more than that. I think maybe 1,500 or 1,600 words into story number 5 for volume 3. And I had an epiphany a couple of days ago, and I am now very excited about a brand new story that I will be beginning immediately after that. And so, to answer your question, it's physical things that are happening in medical advancements, But also, there are some really crazy things happening with comms, communications and communication systems, and the way that we handle and manage communications
Okay.
systems, and also how we can protect our sovereignty, and how, yeah.
Well,
My C
no,
word
don't give
works.
too much away. I appreciate that answer because I'm looking forward to that very much now. Yes, everybody, as I say, Science Fiction Tales, Volume 1 and 2. Thank you very, very much for joining me today. I'm sure we'll do it again, especially when Volume 3 comes out. But
Well, I've enjoyed your company so much that the hour has flown by. I could probably talk to you for another 2 hours. I just love who you are as a person,
why,
and
thank you.
I love your personality. I love your mind, and I just love spending time with you. So I just want to thank you for reading
My
and for
pleasure.
being a part of my life and being a part of my circle, and helping folks to read these stories.
Well, thank you for keeping the flame of science fiction alive, particularly in a literary form. It's very
Thank you.
important. I think it's important. So do you, and I appreciate that very much. So yeah, I will do that YouTube thing that we do now. Please, everybody that watched this, leave a like and a comment and share it out and subscribe if you've enjoyed that. Check out my other content. Go check out Raquel and her various places that she can be found. You're doing regular YouTube stuff as well, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'll leave some links to that. And until next time, everybody, stay well and keep on looking to the future.